Listen. Can you hear that noise? It's water. Right, I'm off to photograph some waterfalls. Shall we have a look and see if I've got anything whimsical and spiritual to say about it? The way I see it, photographing waterfalls is a little bit of an oxymoron. You see, it's all about stillness and movement, and how those two conflicting ideas play out against each other. Oh, that was perfect, mate. So, if you're coming back to the channel, then welcome. If you're new to the channel, then welcome. Today I'm out in the North York Moors on a rather precarious path down to a waterfall. And I'm going to be going through some of the techniques I use to get waterfall photographs. Now, if you like outdoor photography in general, including wildlife and landscape, then please consider giving my channel a like and subscribe, it'd be much appreciated. And now we're going to get into some waterfalls. So in today's video, I'm looking at one-shot waterfall photography. So this is where you get everything in a single shot. So there'll be no compositing, which is a bit more of an advanced technique. I want to just concentrate on the fundamentals. So we're looking at one-shot waterfall photography and how you can best get the results you want within that single frame. So waterfall photography can often be seen as a little bit twee, a little bit chocolate boxy perhaps, and a little bit cliched, but actually it's one of those genres that if you do it well and think about what you're doing, it actually can really hone your skills, particularly in the exposure triangle, because it's these three elements, the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO, that you'll be using to play off against each other and control the image and to hopefully get the image you want. But it's going to be particularly good for beginners who really want to get the basic knowledge of that exposure triangle down. So in terms of focus, in a waterfall scene, it's pretty much like any standard landscape photography, but you've actually got less sort of distance to contend with because usually the waterfall's a bit closer to you. So I tend to stick between f11 and f16 to guarantee that front to back sharpness, and then focus a third of the way into the scene or on the waterfall itself, and then just check your images afterwards to make sure that you're clear right the way through, and you should get front to back sharpness. But before we get into all of that, there's a few sort of bits of kit that you're going to want that are going to make your life a lot easier. One of them is decent footwear. You're going to want something that's waterproof or water resistant, or just not mind getting your feet wet. You're going to want probably some pretty resistant clothes because they're going to get dirty. You're going to be scrabbling about on rock and all that sort of business. You're going to get wet. So just, you know, wear stuff that's going to protect you from that, stuff that's going to take a few knocks and scrapes, and it will just make your life a bit more comfortable. Photography can get very expensive if you're not careful, but as you can see here, I'm rocking my Dunlop wellies, which are about 15 quid I think, and they do the job really well. They're not the most comfortable of things, but put on a nice pair of socks and you're winning. In terms of basic camera kit that you're going to want, really, it's a camera and a tripod. You're not really going to get away from the fact that you need a tripod, particularly if you want that nice flowing water look where you've got them slightly longer exposures. Perhaps some of the more modern cameras you might be able to hand hold a shot for that long, but I'd still recommend having a tripod with you. Other essentials are probably going to be stuff to clean your lens free of moisture, so a cloth and a blower would be quite handy in this situation, and that's sort of a fundamental kit. There are other things you can get which will help, and I would highly recommend a circular polarizer filter, probably over NDs, because that's going to reduce the amount of light getting to your sensor by about a stop anyway, and so you've still got loads of settings to play with. If you're out on particularly bright sunny days, then yeah, you probably will need an ND, but most of the time, if you come out at the right time of day or the right time of year, or in these like wooded locations, you probably won't need an ND, but a circular polarizer will do wonders. So what do polarizers do and how do they help your image? Well, I've got one on my camera here. You can see it on the front there. What I'm going to do, I'm recording this bit here. So as I turn the polarizer, you'll see how the reflection on the surface changes. So we'll turn it here, and that pretty much gets rid of the reflection of the light's reflection in the water. So this is going to be really good if you've got particularly underwater elements that you can see. It's going to really bring them out, and it can give you a cleaner image, and it means you can concentrate more on the froth rather than the reflection. You know, you don't always want to kill it completely. It's not always the look that everyone likes. I quite like that deep look, but a little bit of light can also be good, so it's just worth playing around with it. But to have that tool to be able to shape the reflection in your composition is really going to help it out. So at this first shot, I've got the polarizer turned to its maximum, and you can see that has made the water go really deep and dark. Now, there are no elements under the water really that you can see that well in here, but what it has done is really highlighted the pathway of the white foamy water. So that really traces that line up towards the waterfall, creating a bit of a leading line. On this next shot, I've just let a little bit more of the reflection stay, and for me, I probably prefer it. It gives a little bit more depth to the image. Just that little bit of light reflection on the surface gives a little bit more sort of 3D sort of effect to the image. You can still see the pathway of the water really clearly. You can see the foam bubbles trickling out a bit, and yeah, I think for me that's the better effect, just because there's a lack of foreground interest under the water. And when we look at them side by side, you can just see the subtle differences between there. And one of the main things to point out is the difference it makes to the actual colour of the scene. You can see the one with the polarizer is a bit more saturated than the one with a little bit less polarizer on it. So that's something to bear in mind. If you want to get those really nice saturated colours, then the polarizer is a really good filter for that. To really highlight the power of a polarizer, I've taken this image here. Now this was taken with full polarization on. You can see the lovely detail in the surface of the water there. It really adds to the composition and pulls your eye up the river. Now if we look at the unpolarized shot, you can see what a difference that makes. All of that detail has been lost in the reflections of the light coming from the sky. So this really highlights how important a polarizer can be. You don't always have to have it just on or off. You can have it at different settings for different effects. So definitely something worth playing with. So I think one of the most important things about waterfall photography is the study of the location. It's really tempting to arrive here, get your kit out and just start shooting away. But actually what you want to do is study your location, have a look for a few compositions, perhaps get your camera in your hand but not on a tripod, and just have a look around, see where you can get to. Because I mean, this location, I don't have loads of opportunities to get to loads of different places, so I'm going to have to figure out where I can get and what focal lengths I can use from there. So visualization is key here. Often, if you're really slowing those shutter speeds down, the water is going to become such an integral part of the composition. So you need to look at the flow of water, where it's going to sit, will it create any leading lines, will it create balance within the scene, and all that sort of stuff. And that's before you even press the shutter. Right, I'm just swapping over to the GoPro because I've got my camera set up on my tripod now, and I'm hoping you can hear me all right on this microphone. If not, this section will probably go to voiceover. But now I've had a good look around, I'm going to go and get myself in position and try and work out a composition. This exposure at the moment is quite dark now, and that exposure was on for a second. Now a second's a lot too long for some people. Some people like it shorter, some people, you know, it's a subjective thing is what I'm trying to say. So dial in the shutter speed that you want. I, for example, want to go down to 1/4 of a second. So I'm going to pull this down. 1/4 of a second. Now you can see my image has gone dark. Now, I've got two things that I can play with here. I've got my aperture and I've got my ISO. Now landscape photographers don't like deviating away from their base ISO, but waterfall photography is a prime example of when you should do this to get the desired effect. So I'm on f11. As you can see, well, the GoPro probably lies a little bit. I'm not actually that far away from the waterfall here, so I can probably get away with a little bit of a less aperture. I'm going to stick to f11 because I'm quite close to the foreground, and I think that will guarantee that I get sharpness from front to back. So what am I left with? Well, I'm left with ISO. So that's what I'm going to have to bump up. Can't change my aperture anymore. I've exhausted that. So it's ISO. So on this camera, I'm quite happy pushing this quite far. I've had images at 3,200, but as long as they're exposed okay, they're fine. A little bit of clean up in Lightroom or Photoshop will do the job. So I've pushed that up to 1600 ISO. That's brought me back into an area that I'm happy with, and I'm going to take the shot. So this first shot is the one that was taken on the second exposure, and as you can see, I've left the polarizer as it was on that last shot, so we've got a little bit of light reflecting on there, and you can really see the line of the water coming down. It's quite smooth. The waterfall looks quite smooth in the background, but when I adjusted my settings and changed to 1/4 of a second, you can see that even though there's less time actually that the frame is exposed for, it gives the illusion of a lot more movement because it's frozen the water. Now this has really highlighted those bubbles at the front. Can you see how that makes it so much more interesting at the front of the composition there, right at the bottom, as the bubbles are coming towards you, and it actually creates more of a lead-in line. You get more movement in the little streamy bit going up to it, and then the waterfall itself conveys more movement as well because there's less water coming down it, so it's less smooth. So it does depend on what sort of effect you're going for, and as I've said before, it can depend on the conditions you're working with, particularly for these single frame captures. If I had more light, I could achieve the same results by leaving my ISO where it was and closing down my aperture a bit. But again, you want to be careful not to go too far because you do run into problems with diffraction, which will make your image softer. So that 1/4 of a second has given me way more movement in the water, or not movement actually, way less movement, so less water's travelling through, so it's frozen the water a little bit more. Now that is a really nice look, particularly if it's coming over quite fast, because it gives you that sense of energy that waterfalls do have. So if we're talking about aperture, it's important to determine which apertures you're happy using. I personally am happy using from about f11 to f16. I know I'm safe in them, and anything outside of that I will have to take on a case-by-case scenario. So if I'm in a particularly tight spot, I know I can go a bit lower. If I really need to, I can push it a bit higher. But then we get into trouble with diffraction, which is another topic. So that's how you can get around it. Aperture and ISO, and it's all of those things working together. I decided to punch in and get a closer composition with a full just falling straight down the middle of the frame. And I've shot this on a few different sort of settings, and it's a really good way of explaining what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to show you the images and talk through how I had to change them and manipulate the camera to get the look I was after. And let me know in the comments which one you like the best. So the first image was taken on ISO 400, which is my base ISO on the Canon EOS R, and it was at f16, and that gave me a 2-second exposure. Now I quite like the look of this. I like the way the water is smoothed out, particularly on these tight compositions. I think it adds that real element of sort of interest, and you can see the pattern in the water going around the rock and the stick in the foreground there. Look at the next image. I've actually halved my aperture to f8, and that has given us a 1/4 of a second. I've had to put my ISO up to 1600 to get this, but it conveys way more movement in there. You can see how the waterfall is frozen a little bit more, and you can see the individual droplets of water sort of bouncing out, but the foreground is also more frozen, and some people prefer this look, some people won't, but it's sort of definitely got more movement in it. So this next one, ISO 1600 again, f8, and I've managed to go for a 1/6 of a second. So again, that's frozen it even more. So you can see even more detail in the water, and you can see even more detail in the foreground here. Now on this last one, I went the other way and actually managed to get a 4-second exposure. So this was f16 again, ISO 400, it got a little bit darker, and so that allowed me to go to 4 seconds, and that's really smoothed out the water in the front there and on the waterfall itself. Now I quite like this if there's these strong compositional elements. It really helps to highlight them and make them stand out and just make the composition look quite interesting. For me, I think I prefer the 2-second one. I think you get a good mix of movement and that sort of strong compositional element created by the longer shutter speed. So let me know in the comments below which one you prefer. So it's also a little bit about knowing what your final image is. You have to have a vision for your image when you come to these places. I know that I can get away with underexposing a little bit because I like to keep my shadows really dark to help accentuate the water in the final image. So if I'm a little bit underexposed in the shadows, it doesn't matter too much to me because I'm going to be bringing them down a little bit anyway. So if I was going to be raising them, that was when I'd be adding noise at a high ISO. So it's worth having an idea of what your image is, and that can be dictated by the environment you're in. So it's evening now, I can only get out after work, so I've got a couple of hours and I just have to work with it getting dark, and you know that my images are going to reflect that, and that's fine. That is exactly what landscape photography should be. They might be accentuated a little bit because it's about the feeling that I have when I'm in these places. Not necessarily, I'm not a documentarian, I'm trying to convey a feeling of the awe I feel in these places. So that visualization that we mentioned earlier, that goes deeper than just what your composition's going to look like. That goes right into what you want your final image to look like and what you want that to convey to people. So another thing to point out is when I'm composing my exposures here, I'm not really paying any attention to the exposure meter on the camera. I'm looking at the histogram. I want to keep my highlights as close to that right hand edge of the histogram as I can without blowing any out. I want all that detail in there, and that's the detail I want, is the highlights. So the blacks can be crushed a little bit. I definitely want the highlights. If it's really tricky, I might take multiple exposures, but for these purposes I want to avoid that. So I've just moved up the river a bit and I've got this composition here. Now this is one of these compositions where I really just want to remove all of the reflections, or as much of the reflection on the water as I can, and let that line of water that's creating the sort of foam do the job of being the leading line. This is a really nice composition actually. I couldn't get in here the other day when I came up because the water flow was just too much. So to be able to do this today and get in the river is pretty good. I'm properly in it here. I'm a little bit forced into a longer shutter here because it's getting a bit darker, but I'm going to try a second, I'm going to pump it up, and I'm going to try half a second. I'm going to show them both, and I'd like you to tell me which one you prefer. So for this first shot I actually ended up going for a 0.6 of a second exposure. So that has given the water enough time to just smooth out a little bit, but you still get that sense of movement, and it really sort of creates that leading line up to the waterfall. All in all, pretty happy with how this one looks. So for the second shot I went for a 1/4 of a second exposure. Now as it's a faster shutter speed, it gives the illusion of more movement in there again. The waterfall looks more active and there's more sort of texture in the foreground. Now in an ideal world I'd probably mix these two captures, but if we're talking about a one shot, I probably prefer the first one, but I do prefer the foreground interest created by the more textured water in this shot. Right, so that's probably it for this one. So that is like a quick rundown, like a beginner's guide almost. I probably, on the back of this, I might do a few more in-depth things of how to take different shots and do compositions, but that's all for another day. So if you've watched this and you've gone out and you've tried to photograph some waterfalls and there's some bit of information you're missing, just let me know in the comments below and I'll try and answer any questions, or I could even make a video about it. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I've really enjoyed making it. It was brilliant to be out in these places. Like, I love landscape so much. I love where I live, and like, I hope that comes across in the images really, and I just want to document these things. So yeah, like I say, do give us a like and subscribe if you've enjoyed it, and I'll be making more landscape and wildlife videos. And you know, basically let's all just get out there and appreciate it and have fun in it and admire it. I mean, this place is amazing. So until next time people, have a good one and happy shooting in the good way. Two dippers just on the rocks behind me. Beautiful little birds. Worried that I'm disturbing them here. I'm just going to pull back a bit. I know what I'm like, disturbing wildlife. very slowly.